This is the Outliers Edge podcast, where we champion the leaders who are shaping the next era of humanity by taking them to the edge of their comfort zone so that they can lead us to the edge of what's next. I'm your host, Niiamah Ashong. Let's do this. Hello there. Niiamah Ashong here, founder of Outliers Edge, where we help you continue to explore what makes you different and find the edge, leverage the edge, and go beyond that edge so you can go and make your biggest impact in the world. Right now, we get an opportunity to have a conversation with Mary Beth O'Connor. And Mary Beth, I'm just so you know, I'm really excited for this conversation. I'm happy to be in space with you here. And we were talking a little bit before we got into this space around just allowing this conversation to be exactly whatever it needs to be for today. So, Mary Beth, I used to go and read everyone's bios beforehand and kind of set it up from that perspective, but I actually realized it was creating a bit of a disconnect. And the disconnect here is that I think with most of the time people have a vision or a vision of a version of someone, and it's that external view of them that tends to play out. And here we want to really just spend some time really focus on you and your inner journey as well. That being said, I know that you're really passionate about a number of different things. You've taken on a lot. So if I was going to meet you at a party and just get to know you from that place there, like how might you describe yourself? How might you share some of the things that you've accomplished so far?
Well, so I mean, there's parties where you're going to talk only about sort of the professional side, right? And then I would probably talk about how I went to law school when I was 32 and I worked at a big firm. And then I became a federal judge, and then I recently retired. But if we were having a real conversation and, let's really open up to each other and get to know each other conversation. For me, the sort of the arc of my story is that I grew up in a very abusive household, which really pushed me to start using drugs at an early age. I started drinking when I was 12 and then moved on to pot and pills and acid. And then I found my drug of choice, which was methamphetamine, when I was 16. And I started shooting up at 17. I was a full-bore addict when I graduated from high school. I did manage to graduate from Berkeley, but I spent 10 years in chaos and misery, went to rehab at 32. I was told in rehab that I had to do it the 12-step way. In other words, I had to have a higher power. I had to agree I was powerless. I had to work the steps. None of that was a good fit for me. So I had to just sort of ignore what they were telling me, pull the ideas I thought were useful, go out and do my own research, find other options, build my own recovery plan. And that allowed me to do those professional things that we talked about. And now I'm on the board for Life Ring Secular Recovery and She Recovers Foundation. And I am really feel very strongly about just educating people about the multiple options they have to recover from the substance use disorder, but also I had to recover from the trauma, right? So it was a multi-phase process. So that's sort of I'd say the brief arc that really would give people a way in to know who I really am. As you say, where I really came from, how far I really was able to push things.
Thanks for that, Mary Beth. You use the words like from junkie to judge here, and as a description of that arc, and it's both compelling in terms of just the phrase itself, but it really does lay out a journey that's here. I would love to spend some time, I think, as we're talking here, exploring a few different elements here that really get to. I mean, I see you as an outlier, and I love to explore the various elements that got us to this conversation, that got you to where you are, and to do it in a way where we do just spend some time essentially slowing down the story, slowing down that arc, and at the same time also looking ahead to what's coming next. All right, so as we play here, I'll let you know I'm focused on three things. I'm looking at how are you an outlier in the world? How did this come to be? Two, what's the edge that you leverage? What's special about you? What gives you an edge? What's your advantage? And then three, what's the edge? What's the limit that you're up against now? The boundary that's up there. And I feel that you're out in the world living against that edge in this moment. But I'd like to continue to explore it from there. Does that sound good to you?
Sure, absolutely.
Awesome. So I think where I just want to slow down and really just like feel into like this opportunity to talk to you here. And I think that the thing that comes here is an element of, you said you were 12 when you first started using, when you first started drinking, if I'm correct.
Yes.
17 is when you would, like, by 17 you were fully in. Um, and then at 32 is when you started going to rehab. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
So like, so that's 20 years.
Mhm.
That's 20 years here. And I think I want to just kind of start from the standpoint of, I'll let you know, like my background, I don't have a lot of like um, language and experience around like addiction and such. So I would actually look to you in any way that where we need to introduce language here, or to create more space so that we can have a deep enough conversation that doesn't stay kind of surface level. I'll look to you to just introduce whatever needs to be brought into this conversation to make sure that we're having a conversation that's fully that yeah, that's fully palpable. Is that okay?
Sure, of course.
All right, great. So I'm thinking about this year, and I'm kind of wondering about like the day before you entered rehab. Like I think I'm really curious because you had lived 20 years up until that point with a certain in a certain way. And there was something that there was something that brought you into rehab there. I don't know if it was by choice, if it was by circumstance or what, but I'd love to just go to like that day, the day beforehand, to what you can recollect. Can you tell me a little bit about what your life was like there, and what actually led to starting down at least one path to recovery?
So, I mean, addiction is really, it's not a fun life, right? It's a really horrible, painful, chaotic, miserable life. And it gets more miserable as time goes on. I mean, don't get me wrong. In the beginning, there's a positive benefit to picking up substances. That's why you keep going. If it was bad in the beginning, probably you would turn around and walk away, right? And in the beginning, it seemed to work to help me manage my pain, to help me, sort of distract myself from my traumatic life. It seemed to be beneficial, but that doesn't last long. In relatively short course, it's misery that just gets worse. So after I graduated from college, so I was 22. So let's say for the last 10 years, I really worked my way down the corporate ladder, is how I describe it. Each job I was less responsibility. Each job I held for less time because my addiction was getting worse and worse and I couldn't get there. But I was also physically deteriorating by the time I went into rehab. My body was starting to break down from 20 years of abuse. I was feeling extremely hopeless. I didn't actually believe I could live another life. I didn't believe recovery was possible. I just couldn't imagine, and it was beyond my imagination is really the short way to say it. And I was tired of the life that I was leading. I couldn't move forward anymore. And when I got laid off from my last job, which by the way was a word processing job for a Berkeley graduate, that's what I was doing. And I could only hold that for 9 months. I was so debilitated. I couldn't even get a new resume together. Like I was just that low. But also my husband was done. Like he was done with me. He was ready to throw me out. He couldn't take it anymore. And so I really threw out rehab as sort of the last chance. Don't throw me out. What if I go to rehab? So there were multiple reasons behind it, but I really wasn't confident at all that I was going to be able to find any other life. The day I walked in the rooms, the day before I went in, I had no confidence that I could find a better path, that I was going to be able to stop.
Like that element of like no confidence you can be able to find a better life. Like when I hear this, I'm hearing the way that you put it here, like falling down the ladder.
Mhm.
And like I'm feeling that journey as it's taken place. And you use the word hopeless here, and hope to me actually, it is a really powerful word. To be absent of hope is not just a small concept there. It's something where it's from hearing yours, like there wasn't any real imagination around what else it could be,
Right.
what else life could be. And so you came into, you started this process here, um with that in mind, I know that you had to go through. Well, tell me a little bit about what it was like when you first got into rehab, and what was the like, yeah, what that was like for you.
So I found a women's rehab. I went to an inpatient women's program, and I just assumed it was, a medical treatment facility. But it turned out that the day I got there, every day they would work on one of the 12 steps, which is what Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous are 12-step programs. And every day they would read a step, and there's a book, and they would read the explanation in the book about the step. And it so happened that on my first day, they were doing step 3, which is I turn my will and my life over to the care of God of my understanding, I think is the terminology. And so, being the good student that I was, I raised my hand and I said, well, what about me? I'm an atheist. I don't believe in a higher power. And they did say it doesn't have to be God. It can be any higher power. I said, but I don't believe that. And they told me you have to, or you're going to relapse. I said, I've been here a day and you just told me I'm going to fail. Like, it did not seem to be a good approach to me to tell me that there was only one option when I knew it was an option that wasn't going to work for me at all. So it was a shock. It was a real shock to find that I was in a place that was only offering me a treatment option that wasn't viable for me. I had no idea when I walked in the room that that's where I was.
So like, I'm hearing this where like you're coming in, you're not really imagining anything new for you here, and then you walk in and someone comes and the first thing that they offer you is exactly what wouldn't work for you.
Yes, that is what happened. That's
exactly what happened. So now I get a little curious, Mary Beth, because I'm like, to me, I like, let's say this, when I run into elements where I'm like, I look to kind of have like self-fulfilling prophecies, like, yep, told you so, this wasn't going to work for me, right? Told you so, this, but that's not what happened for you. I want to get into what did happen, but I want to just stay a little bit with that, with like coming there day one, you're sitting here, day one happens to be step 3, they're saying you must have some higher power, otherwise you will relapse here. I'm really curious, like, what kept you going at that point?
It was an interesting dilemma because on one hand, as you say, I'm looking backward at 20 years of mostly poor decision making, right? And yet I'm really faced with deciding, am I going to believe the experts or am I going to think that they must be wrong? Am I going to trust my own judgment? I mean, one thought that crossed my mind was, how could it be possible that no atheist in the history of the world had ever gotten sober? Like, that seemed unlikely to me. But it also was a challenge to trust myself against these purported experts. So it was a dilemma, but I really had to decide very quickly what to do about it. And at first I decided, well, let me see if there's anything in these steps that I can use, So I went through all of them, like in detail. What's sort of the underneath concept? Like step 1 is that you're powerless. I'm powerless over my addiction. But what they want to say is you're powerless, you're out of control in a way. But what I decided was that I agree that I was powerless to moderate. Like Mary Beth can't moderate. And so I went through all of those steps to try to find ideas. Step 3, I turned step 3 into a lesson in limited control. Right? That even though I could do a lot of efforts, like let's say looking for a job, I couldn't control the outcome of things all the time. Some things were out of my control. It was my job to take the positive steps that I could, but I couldn't control all outcomes. And so I went through them all and tried to really think through, is there any idea here that I can use? And then they had classes and they did teach things like how to handle relapses and triggers. And though, so I just try to keep my mind open to all the ideas that I was presented with that would actually benefit me. And that's the approach that I took.
There's an element here, as you say this, that I'm imagining the environment, I'm imagining being in the place here. I'm like, the things that comes to mind here is one of the, like, how can it be possible that no atheist in the history of the world? And I think that's a really interesting question. And so with me, I tend to like hear a question and both see it exactly as its position, but similar to you, like go underneath it. Like, all right, if this is true, what makes this such a powerful statement? And I think, like, I'm thinking about this from the standpoint of how powerful can it be, how as a tool to just ask yourself that question there? Like, how is it possible that literally no one else in the history of the world has been able to accomplish X, Y, and Z, or do it this and do it in any other type of way? And I think that, like, right now, like I'm thinking about that as just a tool to move forward here, especially when I think about outliers that are going off and creating new paths for themselves. Like, there's this element of, a lot of times we haven't seen the path, or most people around us are doing it a certain way, or there's an expert or an authority that says it must be done this way. And that question, how can it be possible that no atheist in the history of the world, no blank in the history of the world has done it some other way and been successful? And I think that, like, there's just something about that statement that really stands out to me there.
Yeah, it is true. You're right that the way to move forward for many of us is to forge our own path. And that often means rejecting whatever the experts may be telling us, or what sort of the common belief system is. And that's hard to do. I mean, it's hard to do. And it really, I think in the long run strengthened me, because I really had to decide to trust myself and to make decisions for myself. And in the long run, that was beneficial. In the short run, it was really scary. And I worried that I was making the wrong decision to, not follow the path that was laid out for me. But in the long run, having to find my own path, having to find my own way forward, making decisions for myself, it sort of taught me how to handle life in general, and life beyond sobriety, right? I mean, to make choices and to make decisions, and to do the analysis about what's right for Mary Beth, what's Mary Beth's path forward, what's Mary Beth's next step, not what's right for other people. Because 12 steps is a good fit for many people, and that's great. But it wasn't right for me. And so throughout sort of the rest of my life after that day, I've really focused on figuring out what's right for Mary Beth, and what's the next positive step forward for me.
Yeah, let's continue on then. So, like, from that day and like how you've continued on your life there, what's right for Mary Beth? Take us here. You went through rehab. I gotta ask this, like, how successful, I know overall how successful that approach was, but while you're going through while you're in rehab, how successful was that? Like it's one thing, I guess my thing is, I like to make sure that as much as we look at the positive elements of it and the inspiration that's behind it, I also like to make sure that we're not missing the messy parts of it too. So let me ask it this way. Tell me a little bit more about the messiness that was in there that maybe was attributed more toward the element of trust in yourself. I know that there's also the process of going through rehab, but choosing to go through it in this environment, forging your own path. Tell me a little bit about the messiness and some of the ways that some things you had to navigate through.
I mean, I definitely was challenged by the staff. Every time I would raise questions, they would tell me that I was running on self-will. They would tell me my best thinking got me there, to which I would say, I promise it wasn't my best thinking. They really hammered on me that, to try to force me into that peg. And that was challenging, because these are the people that I was turning to for treatment. And so it was sort of interpersonally challenging to try to get them to help me in ways that would be useful. In other words, not to antagonize them to the point that they sort of threw their hands up, but that they were still invested in helping me. So that was one challenge. The other thing was that the other women, when I would raise questions, they sometimes pushed back. And then I didn't want to do anything that was going to hurt the other women's recovery. You know what I mean? I was really conscious that I didn't want to make it to try to dismantle what was working for them just because it wasn't going to work for me. And so that was a challenge, to try to be able to be true to myself, but in an appropriate way, to not sort of, thrash around and, knock bodies down in my path, but to really try to find a way to just stay strong for myself. But in the long run, part of what was the challenge was really to get rid of the fear, because I did struggle with fear that maybe they're right, maybe I'm just wrong here. They keep telling me, all of them tell me that I am wrong. And that created some unnecessary, really, anxiety and concern that, through the first early months, it created discomfort, because I really didn't know if I was right. How am I going to know until I test it out, right? How am I going to know until I see if I can find my own path? So there was fear, there was anxiety, there was concern.
I really appreciate you bringing this up, Mary Beth, because I feel like this is where it's like that fear, that anxiety, that element of like, I don't know if this is going to work. And right. Like, I'll talk to people and they'll describe it as, when they're choosing to forge their own path, they're like, well, like, what if it doesn't work? What if I'm wrong? Is there a reason why I'm the only one that's doing this? Like, as much as I like to think that I'm a maverick or I'm going down my own path here, it's like, is it happening for a reason? So I'm happy that you brought that in here, because I think that, like, that's the part that oftentimes I'll read different articles, or I'll read different things, and I'm like, I'm missing that component of it all, where it's like, it feels like you can just be confident in it, but actually what I'm hearing from you is like, you were just incredibly courageous, and you were like in that fear and choosing to still be courageous with that. Am I right in this? Don't let me put words in your mouth. I just want to just kind of check in, and then we'll go to what happened afterwards.
I mean, I was afraid, but I really, but the dominant part of me believed I had to find another way, that this really wasn't going to work for me. But that doesn't mean that I didn't toss and turn sometimes at night, or feel those twinges, of anxiety at times, because I certainly did. I absolutely did. And I did in the end. When I got out, when I went home, I actually went to the library to see if there were other ways, because they told me that there weren't. And that at about 8 months, I actually found that there were other programs. They just didn't tell me. But even with that, I never adopted any one program. I ended up just pulling, as I did from the beginning, I pulled the ideas out of each different option that I read about. I'm on the board for Life Ring, that was SOS. Then I pulled ideas out, and I really made an individual plan that worked for me. And so even when I found sort of a relief, there are other ways, that was really like 8 months in. I had already made the decision for myself to try to do it my way. That was a weight off my shoulders to know that people had done it another way, but I still didn't do it their way either. I ended up doing it a way that worked for me by combining and synthesizing ideas.
So take me now then, I want to continue on this journey, because I'm getting it to understand a little bit of what works for you, a little bit of what gives you an edge when it comes to forging your own path. And part of what I'm hearing is, there's a way of being respectful, respecting the process, but at the same time, not being dominated by it. I'll use that for this time. To go out, do the research, find other things and at the same, and take what works for you and apply it. And I'm also hearing there's an element of understanding and trying to understand like what's at the core of this. I often call them like best principles versus best practices. It's like, why does this practice work? What's the underlying thing that makes this work? And how can I stay true to the principle that this is trying to, the principle that's at play here, while making it work for me. Let me just check really quickly. Like, those are three things right now that seem to stand out to me around your approach and around this year. Is there anything else that I might have missed? Is there anything else that comes to mind here?
No, I mean, the only thing that when you talk about that, I think about sort of some things I had certain strengths for, but I also did have certain areas that I really needed to work on. And so that was part of that path over the next few years is sort of using the strengths I already have, but really having to develop in a lot of other areas as I moved out into the real world.
Yes. All right. So let's see here. I'm trying to see how we can play in this conversation. I love to get, so now you're out in the real world, right? I think what I love, I know that you're really about exploring like multiple ways to recovery. So I want to give us enough time to explore that here. So you come out into the real world, and let's see. So because I'm like, well, what's the path then to judge?
Yes.
So because it feels like a completely different life. It feels like when you talk about not being able to see it beforehand, like it feels like that journey has continued on for you. So tell me a little bit more about that.
So when I got into rehab, as I had a really choppy work history, as you know, I described, right? So my first job when I got home was, and I was a Berkeley graduate, it was a part-time, temporary, low-level administrative assistant job, because that's all I could handle. Like for me to get up and go to work every day on time and stay all day and do a good job and do that tomorrow, I was 32 and I had never done that in my entire life. So I really had to sort of develop basic work habits, basic productivity habits. And so then I moved up. My next job was a full-time mid-level administrative job. And then I got a promotion at a bigger company as a supervisor of other administrative people. And then I moved up there. And then, but when I had around 6 years sober, I really looked around me and I didn't want my boss's job or my boss's boss's job. And so I said, well, I'm in the wrong place. And so I had always had law school as, you know, one of the ideas of my mind since I was young. And by now I'm, you know, so I was 6 years sober, so I'm like 38, 39 years old. And I thought either I'm going to get to law school now, or I just need to admit I'm never going to do it. And so I did. I went to law school when I was 39 years old, when I had 6 years sober, also at Berkeley. And then I worked at a big law firm doing big cases, you know, high value dollar cases. I eventually went to work for the federal government doing big dollar cases for them. And then when I had, let's see, in 2014, when I would have had a little over 10 years sober, I was appointed a federal administrative law judge. And that was my, you know, sort of something I didn't see coming. It wasn't something I would have known in the beginning, but that was the arc, that was the professional arc. In a span of 10 years, I went from an entry-level administrative position to being a judge.
So let's talk about that for just a bit here. And then we're going to open up.
I'm sorry, I said 10 years. It's 20 years. My apologies. 2014, okay. 20 years.
Okay. So the span of 20 years, like, and I thank you for taking the time to clarify that, right? Again, because I said earlier, we're going to slow things down. And what I get from that, A, it's just your level of integrity. B, that when you're talking about like climbing your way down, you know, working your way down, like I can feel you like actually climbing your way up this time.
Yes,
you know, yes. And what I'm also hearing is that it wasn't a how do I say it? You started exactly where you were. You know, it wasn't that you're like, oh, and then I decided to go to law school or anything like that. You know, and I say this here from the standpoint of just really looking at like you know, a rags to riches story. You know, we might get lost in the elements of, and then I won the lottery, and that's not like that's not the actual course for you here. You actually spent years building yourself back up, going back in, doing the work here. Again, I want to make sure that I'm capturing it properly here. Take it from there. Like, tell me about that. The 20 years for you overall.
Yeah, I mean, so I do like to emphasize, you're absolutely right. It is an incremental process, whether it's recovery or life in general, right? It's step by step. And I had to start where I was. I could wish that because I had this fancy degree that I would have a higher level job, but I wasn't ready for it. And so I had to start from where I was and move myself forward step by step and be realistic. And one of the techniques that I really found useful was to look backward at times and see how far I've come. Because for me, I always tended to see what I didn't have yet, right? Yeah. And where I wasn't, or what somebody else.
Mary Beth, I know that one very, very well. I know that one very well. Yeah.
And so pausing and looking backward intermittently, I think, is a really valuable technique. It really can build your confidence and really give you a more accurate depiction of what you've accomplished over a period of time. But it's a process. Part-time job, full-time job, promotion, then law school. At 39, 6 years sober, not a year sober, 6 years sober. That's when I was ready for it. And then moving forward from there. And so most of life in all areas of my life, that's sort of consistent pattern, right? You start where you are, you set maybe the next goal. I never had the goal of being a judge, but I always had, what's the next step for me? What's my next step? Or what do I need here in order to qualify me for the 3 next steps that I'm thinking about, right? And so always that preparation. If I'm in the job, making sure I get the experiences and the skills that are going to help me land the next promotion, the next step forward. But for me, it was also a lot of learning things. Like, I mean, one of the advantages I had was I was always, I always did well in school. I was always considered smart. That was an advantage. But I was a meth addict. My interpersonal skills needed work. Okay. Yeah. And so that was a challenge for me as I was working in an office environment and eventually supervising people. I was not perfect. I could be a little harsh sometimes, or my anxiety could be triggered if I thought someone was criticizing me. And so all of those things took years to really improve and get to where they needed to be to make me able to handle the next step. And, not leaping forward, but doing the work to make you truly ready for what's coming next.
As you say it, Mary Beth, I'm just taking that in here. I'm taking that in, and I acknowledge you. And I also acknowledge like this part of the process too, as much like even with the forging of your own path, there's like, it's nice to be able to look at it from a holistic perspective. Right. And like, I acknowledge you for the path that you've taken here. I know I'm really curious now about are you still working actively as a judge right now?
No, I took early retirement 2 years ago. And so now mostly I do my advocacy work. So I was a judge for 5.5 years.
All right, lovely. So like, tell me a little bit more about your advocacy work. I love to spend more time in there and just give it a little bit more space for what you're about right now.
Well, it's interesting because I was talking with my friend the other day and saying, really, I've been able to use being a judge to my advantage in certain ways in the advocacy, because it's an unusual path, to go from an IV meth addict to a judge. And so it catches attention, which helps me get opportunities to talk about multiple paths to recovery. So I started with my advocacy work. I joined the Board of Life-Ring Secular Recovery, which is a non-faith-based recovery program. And that was the first time I ever told an employer that I was in recovery, because I had to clear it through ethics because I was a judge. So that was one step of opening up and sort of, okay, I want to tell them. I didn't say what my drug of choice was. My guess is they assumed alcohol, but I did tell them that I was in recovery. And by the way, I do have 28 years now, just 20 years in a couple of days.
I want to just acknowledge that as well, real quick here. It's like, yeah, let me the way I say congratulations, and at the same time I'm like, congratulations doesn't feel like it covers it, because I don't know, again, like if I found $20 on the street, I'll say congrats. That's just a random thing, like well created, like like that I really do want to just acknowledge you on.
Thank you. Yeah. And so then I started doing some writing. So I had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal called I Beat Addiction Without God in August of 2020, which got, some attention. It was reprinted in a lot of places. I wrote an op-ed for the Philadelphia Inquirer. I'm on the board now. Then I joined the board for She Recovers Foundation. And She Recovers isn't just for recovery from substance use disorder, but it's also for women recovering from trauma, which many people with early addiction histories like me have, child abuse histories or sexual assault histories, or people with other behavioral disorders or mental health challenges. So that's a good group for me because I meet the criteria, multiple times. And so I'm doing that. And then I've started speaking more openly about, my personal path. And so I do podcasts like here, I've been on the radio, and all of that for me is just about, I use my personal story as an example of the options for recovery, that you can do it, with 12 steps, you can do it with Women for Sobriety or Life-Ring or She Recovers, or you can do it your own way by pulling ideas from multiple places. My goal is to let people know that they have choices so that they can find the right fit for them, because that, I believe, will increase their chances of success. And that's really what I want. I want everyone coming into recovery to have the best possible chance of success.
I feel that, Mary Beth. I feel that just coming through, and just like what you've done to put your life in alignment with that for others there. I am now going to play the game that I play, which goes to, you said that uh, you talked about like the first time that you actually put on like in an employment thing that you had been in recovery, or that you're in recovery. So the elements, I mean, now we're talking here. We're talking here on this podcast. We're having like this conversation here. And right before we started here, you're like, you can ask me anything. I can go anywhere. I'm really curious about the transition that took you to a place where you're like, actually, I will let my personal story end up in the public space such that it can actually be of support for other people. I'm curious about that there, because I think that is another jump that we as outliers go through, and I'm really curious about that for you.
Well, I really felt that I was at a place where I could be public without the ramifications that many people face, right? A lot of people are afraid they're going to be professional ramifications, or they don't want their entire community to know. So professionally, I was at a place where the ramifications weren't going to really impact me. And otherwise, I don't really care who else knows. My family had a general idea, but they actually have learned a lot of details through listening to my speaking engagements. My friends have learned a lot of details, and it is really freeing in a way now to be able to say, you can ask me anything and I'll tell you. It's a very different place to be. It feels like I'm able to be my whole self, without having to think about what does Bob know, or what does Susan already know, and having to sort of parse what I say around different groups of people, work friends, or used to be a work friend, but now you don't work there anymore, Facebook, or, LinkedIn. I can just say anything, anywhere. And it's a very liberating position to be in for the first time in my life, really.
Yeah, it put a smile on my face as you're saying it, because it's like, there's this element of just being able. My number one value is integrity. So when I hear you say this here, and it's been a developing value as I realize how much I people please, how much I send out to try and be what I think other people are looking for from me. And so the element of almost compartmentalizing, or having to navigate, or put in the mental energy of what will work in this environment, what can be said, what can't be said, how do I want to deal with what happens when I bring someone else in a little bit more. I'm hearing when you say like the freedom, like liberated from having to worry about that, and you can just be free and just be you in this.
Yeah, and it does feel, it feels like I'm complete in a way for the first time. It's not that I was, it's not that it was being dishonest with people, but there were just relationships were in a certain box. This was in a box, and now there's no edges to the box anymore.
Yeah.
And so it feels like I'm able to also be of more value, right? Because, like, for example, just yesterday, a former work colleague emailed me because a family member is having a substance use disorder problem and, wants to talk to me. What guidance can I give? All of that. Well, he would never have known if I wouldn't have been open publicly, because he was a former work colleague. And so it gives me opportunities to sort of give back, be of service, in ways that I couldn't before, when only a certain small group of people knew the whole story. And it's not just about the substance use disorder, but also about the trauma history. I mean, I had a really severe rape when I was in college. I had, a lot of abuse at home. And I like to bring that out as well, just to reassure people who have had similar experiences that there is a way to recovery, there is a way forward, there is a way out. And the judge is really the professional accomplishment, right? But the more important accomplishment for me is really, first of all, living without the chaos of addiction. Like, that is 100% more important than the judge. But it's also about finding a way to deal with, to get past the post-traumatic stress disorder, to get past the anxiety, to really get to a place where I'm enjoying my life and not being impacted nearly as much by the traumas that were put on me at an early age. So there's just so much sort of joy in my life at this point that that I experience it, but I also like to share it so that other people know that they can find it too, with time, with work, with effort.
Mary Beth, I think that is just a phenomenal place for us to kind of close today's conversation here. It's if there is one thing that you could share either to me or to anyone else that might listen to this at some point here, what would that be? And then afterwards, we can let them know of any contact or any other resources that you'd like to share.
Well, I remember in the beginning, you talked about hope when I said hopeless. And I guess part of my message is, no matter where you are, there is always hope, to find the next step forward. You can find a path forward. I encourage people to try to find just enough hope to take that first step, and then with success, the hope sort of naturally grows on its own as you see that you're making progress. So have hope. There absolutely is hope. There's a path out of whatever your struggles are. There is a path forward.
Absolutely fantastic. So thank you for this. Thank you for this whole conversation, Mary Beth. Like the element of, and I love how even with the hope, it's like, just to take that step, without having to know where it's all going to end or anything like that. So just thank you for that. I don't want to say anything else on that because I want to let your words be land there. For those of us that would like to continue getting to know you, continue down the journey here, continue to explore some of the resources or things that you have available, what would you like to share for us from that standpoint?
So I have a website, junkie2judge.com, and people can message me through that website. They can sign up to get notifications. I've actually written a book, and my agent is trying to get a publisher, so you would get notified when the book comes out, all of that. But I'm always happy to respond to any questions or input from anyone. Feel free to reach out for any reason.
Absolutely. Well, Mary Beth, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for taking us on your journey. I see you as an outlier, and I see you said something here that I want to also just make sure I just say. You said if we were talking just a bit ago, you're talking about I feel like I have no more edges, and it actually came to me. I was like, oh, maybe that's the point of Outliers Edge, to get to the place where we can go so far out that there are no more edges. There is no place that feels like you're an outlier. You can just be complete. You can just be whole, and you can be free and liberated in everything that you do. And so thank you for that. You even brought me another level of alignment here in this conversation. I appreciate you.
I appreciate you having me too. And I really enjoyed the conversation today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Ready to play at your edge? Come join us inside of the Outliers Edge multiverse, where you have the opportunity to come for 14 days and play in the sandbox of your unique leadership style and take everything about you to its next edge. Go to outliersedge.com/OE guest pass in order to receive your 2-week gift.